Good afternoon, my name is Kyra, and today we will hold an expert debate addressing the question, what came first, the chicken or the egg? The dilemma of which came first, the chicken or the egg, relies on the observation that all chickens hatch from eggs, and all chicken eggs are laid by chickens, so cause and effect seem to form a closed loop. In modern evolutionary biology, the question is largely considered settled. Reproductive structures of the amniotic egg type arose in the ancestors of reptiles and birds hundreds of millions of years ago, whereas the domestic chicken is a very late domesticated species. Nevertheless, this scheme continues to be actively used as a metaphor for discussing causality, infinite regress, and the first cause in philosophy, religion, and even quantum physics. The aim of the debates here is not simply to choose the answer egg or chicken, but to show how different scientific and worldview frameworks interpret the very question in different ways, and what the choice of answer reveals about our intuitions regarding cause and beginning. Roles of experts. An evolutionary biologist defends the position of modern biology and paleontology. Eggs, as a reproductive structure, appeared long before chickens, already in ancient amniotes, and the first chicken arose as the result of mutations in an egg laid by a non-chicken, a proto-chicken. A philosopher of causality and logic considers the dilemma as an example of the problem of what counts as cause and what as effect, of infinite regress, and of the semantic vagueness of the concepts chicken and chicken egg, and analyzes different answers as logical schemes. A theologian, creationist, relies on the idea of creation and a first cause. God creates animals at once in a completed form, therefore the logical and theological answer is that the chicken, or a pair of chickens created by God, came first, and eggs are already a consequence. A physicist, researcher of quantum causality, uses analogies with quantum indeterminacy and the concept of indefinite causal order to show that, at a fundamental level, situations like chicken or egg can be non-classical, and that our question is an overly crude projection onto the macro world. Evolutionary biologist. From the standpoint of evolutionary biology, amniotic eggs, which enable fully terrestrial reproduction in vertebrates, appeared at least 300 million years ago in early amniotes, the ancestors of modern reptiles, birds, and mammals. This was a key step after the move away from an aquatic environment. A tough shell and special embryonic membranes made it possible to lay eggs on land and become almost independent of water, which radically expanded the available ecological niches. The domestic chicken, according to genetic and archaeological data, was domesticated by humans from the red jungle fowl in Southeast Asia only 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, that is, many orders of magnitude later than the appearance of the first amniotic eggs. Moreover, even in the evolution of birds as a clade, hard-shelled eggs existed long before the emergence of the particular lineage that became the ancestor of modern chickens. Within the framework of gradual evolution of species, there is no leap out of nothing. The so-called first chicken appears as an individual slightly different from its ancestors but already belonging to a new species by the totality of inherited traits. A realistic scenario is as follows. A population of proto-chickens, very similar to chickens, accumulates mutations, and in one particular fertilized egg, the combination of mutations produces a phenotype that it is already reasonable to classify as a chicken in the strict biological sense. This egg containing the first chicken still belongs by its maternal origin to a non-chicken, but by its contents it is already a chicken egg in the sense of who will hatch from it. Then, if a chicken egg is defined by whose organism is inside, it is precisely such an egg that logically precedes the first adult chicken, and therefore the egg with the first chicken turns out to come before the first chicken as an adult individual. However, if one defines a chicken egg by who laid it, then the first egg laid by an actual chicken should be considered the first genuine chicken egg, and in this narrow definition the chicken comes first logically. Biology as a discipline tends to choose the definition based on the genetic and embryonic contents rather than on the species of the mother, and therefore in the scientific literature it is usually stated that from an evolutionary point of view, the egg as a structure, and specifically the egg with the first chicken, precedes the chicken. Strong argument 1 for this position is that there is a rich paleontological and phylogenetic record showing the antiquity of amniotic eggs and the gradual nature of transitions between species, so egg before chicken fits naturally into the broader picture of evolution. Strong argument 2 is that the formal definition of the species and of a chicken egg through the genetic composition of the embryo makes it possible to answer the question clearly, without appealing to supernatural entities and without a logical paradox. Philosopher of causality and logic. In philosophy, the chicken or egg dilemma has long been used as a vivid example of a causal paradox and of the difficulty of determining where to begin and where to cut off a chain of causes and effects. The observation that all chickens come from eggs and all chicken eggs come from chickens sets up a situation in which each link simultaneously appears as both a necessary condition and the result of the other, which resembles an infinite regress or a closed circle. In this context, definitions are especially important. If by a chicken egg one means an egg laid by a chicken, then the logical form of the question differs from the case in which it means an egg containing a chicken. In the first definition, the chain chicken, chicken, egg, chicken really does seem closed. In the second, one can logically allow an egg containing the first chicken but laid by a non-chicken, which removes the paradox. Thus, part of the dispute is purely semantic, connected with which predicates we ascribe to objects and how we construct genus-species relations between concepts. A philosopher will view this dilemma as a question of what to regard as primary, a particular event, the hatching of an individual, or a type toaster species as a stable structure in the chain of generations. At the same time, a deeper level arises. Even if the local paradox is removed by a correct definition, the general question remains whether the entire causal chain of the world has a first point, or whether we are dealing with an infinite regress or a closed structure. In the history of thought, the question of the chicken and the egg has been linked both with the theological idea of a creator as first cause and with naturalistic models of the world in which every cause is itself the effect of earlier states. A strong argument for the philosophical position is that it shows how many disputes about the first object are disputes about the meanings of words and criteria of identity rather than about facts of nature, thereby clarifying the structure of the question. A second strong argument is that transferring the dilemma to the level of the general problem of causality makes it possible to use it as a tool for analyzing infinite regress, first cause, and what beginning means in ontology. A theologian or creationist. In a theistic, and especially creationist worldview, the starting point is not a blind causal chain, but the free act of the Creator, who sets the initial states of the world according to a design rather than as the result of preceding natural processes. In the biblical tradition, for example, it is said that God creates every winged bird according to its kind, as already formed animals capable of reproduction, not as embryos or eggs. Accordingly, in this model, the logical first place goes to the chicken, or to a pair of chickens at once, possessing the full set of species properties and the ability to lay eggs, while eggs are something derivative, an instrument for continuing the life that has already been created. A theologian will see in the chicken or the egg not a biological but a worldview question. Do we believe in a self-moving causal chain without ultimate meaning, or in a single source that sets the initial act? In creationist argumentation, the egg, as a highly organized system, is viewed as an example of holistic design. The set of structures, shell, membranes, yolk, metabolic chemistry, functions too coherently to be assembled gradually without a guiding plan, and therefore is perceived as a consequence rather than an original cause. The theological version thus cuts off the infinite regress. Instead of an endless series of before, it posits a first free cause that does not itself need an explanation of the same type as the objects it created. From this perspective, the question, which came first, the chicken or the egg, is effectively reformulated as which came first, creation or evolution? And the answer will be, first, the Creator and the living beings created by Him, while biological processes are the internal dynamics of an already created world. Strong argument 1 of this position, for its adherents, is that it provides a clear and final starting point, removing the problem of infinite regress and giving the world purpose and meaning. Strong argument 2. Historically, for a vast number of cultures, it has been intuitively natural to posit a personal creator as an explanation for order and purposiveness in nature, and the chicken and egg dilemma is then built into a much broader theological picture of creation. Physicist, researcher in quantum causality. In modern quantum causality theory, it has turned out that the very assumption of a clear linear order, first A, then B, does not always hold. There exist processes with so-called indefinite causal order, where it is impossible to say unambiguously what was earlier and what was later. In experiments with a quantum switch, the operations of two observers on a system occur in a superposition of different orders, so that from the viewpoint of the formalism, the process does not decompose into a single fixed sequence of causes and effects. Popular summaries of these studies often use the metaphor, in the quantum world, the chicken and the egg can both come first, to illustrate the gap between our intuitive ideas about time and the real possibilities of quantum processes. Although this is of course a metaphor, it is a useful one. It emphasizes that the familiar binary scheme, a strictly before B, may be too crude for the deepest level of describing reality. From the standpoint of a physicist working with such phenomena, the classical question, what came first, the chicken or the egg, imposes an oversimplified picture of deterministic, linear causality in the macro world, whereas even the fundamental laws allow for much more complex structures of causal links. Our brain is used to ordering events linearly, but quantum experiments show that the existence of processes without a global definite order is compatible with physics and can provide computational advantages. Therefore, the quantum physical answer will be more skeptical toward the very formulation of the question. It will suggest focusing not on two objects, chicken, egg, but on a network of processes in which the notion of strictly before is not always fundamental. Strong argument one of this position is that it demonstrates how our intuitive logic of causality is only a special case of a more general structure of causal relations that manifests itself at the quantum level. Strong argument 2. Using the dilemma as an analogy helps to explain the concept of indefinite causal order in a popular form and thereby broadens our understanding of how the world can be structured at all, without any obligatory choice of egg or chicken in the classical sense. An evolutionary biologist criticizes the creationist position by pointing out that it ignores the huge body of paleontological and comparative anatomical evidence, indicating the gradual evolution of both birds and their eggs from ancient amniote forms to modern species, including chickens. The transition from reptiles to birds and then to domesticated chickens is well traced both in fossil remains and in genetic studies, and the claim of a ready-made chicken without ancestors directly contradicts this body of evidence. Appealing to a creator as the first cause, from a biological point of view, looks like stopping the explanation. Instead of clarifying the mechanisms by which traits and eggs originated, an entity is introduced that is declared to be outside any mechanisms. As for the quantum approach, it is interesting, but the direct transfer of ideas of indefinite causal order from the level of photons to biological objects such as chickens and eggs is methodologically incorrect. At these scales, causal relations in organisms and populations are perfectly described by classical physics and evolution. Therefore, in this case, the reference to quantum weirdness risks turning into a category mistake, a substitution of a concrete evolutionary question with general reasoning about fundamental physics that does not change the biological picture. The most vulnerable point in the theological position is the sharp gap between the created, ready-made chicken and its absence in the preceding nature, which does not fit the data on gradual transitions. The most vulnerable point in the quantum position is the risk of pseudoscientific interpretations, when real, strictly constrained experiments with indefinite order begin to be used as a universal metaphor that anything goes, which has almost nothing to do with the evolution of chickens. An evolutionary biologist criticizes the theologian and the physicist. A philosopher points out that the evolutionary position, despite its empirical grounding, also cuts off the causal chain in its own way when it speaks of a specific egg with the first chicken, as if one could clearly single out the moment of transition from non-chickens to chickens in a continuous sequence of generations. In reality, defining a species and deciding from which generation we count a population as chicken remains to some extent conventional and depends on chosen criteria, which undermines the appearance of an absolutely clear first egg. The creationist version, in turn, does indeed radically break the infinite regress, but does so by introducing a first cause that itself is not subject to the same type of explanation as the other links in the causal chain. From a logical point of view, this can be seen as substituting the problem. Instead of answering the question, why is there this ordered causal structure, it posits an entity that explains everything but is itself left unexplained. Both approaches, in different forms, use a strategy of stopping the regress, either at the level of the first chicken in evolutionary history or at the level of the creator. And here, philosophical analysis shows that we are dealing with a choice of metaphysical framework rather than a purely factual question. The most vulnerable point of the evolutionary version is its underestimation of the semantic vagueness in defining chicken and chicken egg, which creates the illusion that the paradox has been fully dissolved. The most vulnerable point of the theological version is its dependence on a particular religious tradition and on the assumption of the supernatural, which for a non-believer or agnostic will not look like a convincing way to break the regress. The evolutionary approach, by insisting on an infinite or at least very long chain of ancestors, in effect sidesteps the question of first cause. It describes how one form of life passes into another, but does not explain why the very possibility of such transitions exists, or where the laws that structure evolution come from. For theology, an infinite regress of causes without an initial support appears logically and existentially unsatisfying. It offers neither a final foundation nor a meaning beyond the bare fact that things just turned out this way. The philosophical position, in criticizing both evolution and creationism for cutting off the chain, often remains at the level of conceptual analysis and does not offer a positive explanation of why there is an ordered cosmos at all, rather than a chaotic collection of events. From a theological point of view, recognizing the logical necessity of a beginning and a creator looks more consistent, since for such a view, the first chicken is not a problem. Species are created by design rather than derived from preceding forms. The vulnerable point of the evolutionary position is its inability, within its own framework, to answer the question about the meaning and purpose of the existence of chickens, eggs, and life in general, which for many people is no less important than the mechanism of origin. The vulnerable point of a purely philosophical position is the risk of remaining in the realm of abstract logic, without offering a person either a scientific picture of the world or an existential answer about their place and purpose. Both the evolutionary, the creationist, and the classical philosophical versions largely share one assumption, that causality can in principle be described as a linear chain A before B, with a globally defined order, even if they disagree about the first link. However, results on indefinite causal order show that even at the level of fundamental physical processes, the order of events may not be globally defined, so the very intuition that there must be a strict first may be a limited artifact of macroscopic experience. In this sense, the dispute over whether the egg or the chicken was first may exemplify how language, tuned to classical causality, poorly reflects deeper levels of reality's description. At the same time, quantum indeterminacy cannot simply be transferred directly to evolution or theology, but it serves as a reminder that our intuitions about cause and order are not obliged to be universal. The most vulnerable point of all three positions is the tendency to treat as obvious that the question what came first always has a single, well-defined meaning, whereas in light of modern physics, this assumption itself is non-trivial. Given the philosophers' and physicists' criticism, it is worth admitting that the strict biological answer, the egg came before the chicken, really does depend on how the concepts chicken and chicken egg are defined. From the standpoint of the evolution of eggs in general, the issue is essentially settled. Reproductive structures of the amniotic egg type appeared long before chickens, but this does not exhaust the philosophical logical aspects tied to defining the first specifically chicken case. It is important to distinguish the claim, eggs as a class are older than chickens, from the subtler question, can we point to a single first egg with a chicken, under conditions of a continuous succession of generations? The thesis that can be softened is this. Instead of the rigid claim that biology provides the final answer, it is more accurate to say that biology gives a very strong answer to the empirical part of the question, but does not resolve all philosophical nuances of species definition and causality. The criticism that part of the paradox is resolved by careful definitions is fair. Indeed, if one clearly distinguishes between an egg laid by a chicken and an egg containing a chicken, then the formal structure of the question changes and the local circle can be broken. However, a deeper level remains, the question of the beginning of the entire causal chain and of whether it must have a first link or can be infinite or even nonlinear. Therefore, the philosophical position can adjust its emphasis, focusing less on the unresolvability of this everyday paradox and more on how it illustrates general problems of causality and regress. The softened thesis would be this: instead of claiming that the evolutionary or theological versions substitute the question, it is better to say that they implement different strategies for stopping regress within their ontologies, and it is precisely these strategies that the philosopher analyzes. Even within faith in a creator, the question remains open whether God created the world with evolution and gradual change of species built in, or created species in their finished form at once. There are theological models of theistic evolution, in which God sets laws and initial conditions and then allows life to develop naturally. And within these models, the chicken or egg dilemma can be partly addressed using evolutionary data. In this case, the basic claim about God as first cause and source of meaning remains in place for the worldview, but can be combined with acceptance of the scientific picture of the evolution of eggs and chickens. The softened thesis is, instead of a rigid opposition, creationism versus evolution, it is more accurate to speak of a spectrum of theistic positions in which the question, what came first, is reconciled with scientific data in different ways. The evolutionary biologist's criticism of the direct transfer of quantum effects to the biological level is well-founded. Experiments with indefinite causal order do not provide an answer to the chicken and egg question in the empirical sense. Their value here is more conceptual. They show that our intuitive categories of cause, effect, earlier, and later are not mandatory for the fundamental description of processes, and therefore encourage more cautious handling of questions like, what came first? The softened thesis is that instead of saying quantum physics shows that the chicken-egg pair has no order at all, it is more accurate to say that it shows the existence of processes without a globally defined order, which serves as a useful metaphor but not a direct model for biological systems. Model 1. Evolutionary. Eggs, as a reproductive structure in amniotes, appeared long before the emergence of birds and certainly before domestic chickens. And the first individual that it is reasonable to call a chicken arose as a result of mutations in the embryo inside an egg laid by a non-chicken. In this sense, the egg with the first chicken precedes the first chicken as an adult individual, and in this scenario, the answer to the question is, the egg came first. Model 2. Creationist, theistic. God or the first cause creates animals, in this case chickens or their ancestors, directly in a finished form, with an already given ability to reproduce via eggs, so that logically, in the order of explanation, living beings come first, and eggs are a consequence of their fertility. Depending on the theological school, this may mean either the literal creation of the first chickens or the creation of an ancestral stock of birds from which various species, including chickens, then arise. Model 3. Logical philosophical quantum agnostic. The original formulation of the question contains hidden assumptions that chicken and egg are sharply defined entities and that there must be a linear, total, before-after order between them. It is more correct to speak of networks of processes and genus-species transitions, where the first link is often not uniquely defined, while at the fundamental level, if one takes into account quantum examples of indefinite causal order, the very idea of a single global beginning may be inapplicable. For Model 1, its strength lies in the fact that it rests on a consistent body of data from evolutionary biology and paleontology, clearly explaining how eggs and chickens fit into the long history of life on Earth. Its weakness is its dependence on conventional species boundaries and on the terminology of chicken-egg, as well as its limited ability to answer philosophical and worldview questions about meaning and first cause. For Model 2, its strength is its simplicity and intuitive clarity for a believer. There is a creator, there are chickens created by him, and the biological details of the egg are interpreted as a consequence of a plan. Its weakness is its conflict with the large body of evolutionary data when read literally, and the need to introduce a supernatural element that is not testable by scientific methods. For Model 3, from the standpoint of biology, the plus is that it honestly acknowledges the role of definitions and the limits of the intuitive causal scheme, helping to avoid a false sense of a final answer where philosophical indeterminacy remains. The minus is the possible impression of relativism or refusal to answer, if it is taken as suggesting that empirical data on the origin of eggs and chickens do not matter. For Model 1, the philosopher sees a plus in the fact that it provides a solid factual basis for a local answer and shows how changing definitions, by the mother versus by the content, changes the logical result. The minus is a tendency to conflate the empirical claim that eggs are older than chickens, with a stronger but less justified thesis that the problem of the beginning of the causal chain is fully resolved here. For Model 2, the strength lies in a clear ontological structure with a first cause that really does stop infinite regress in a logical sense. The weakness is its dependence on accepting a specific theological metaphysics, which makes this model convincing only for those who already share the relevant religious premises. For Model 3, the advantage is that it makes explicit the hidden assumptions about concepts and causal order, turning the dilemma into a tool of analysis rather than an unsolvable riddle. The drawback is the risk of drifting into purely abstract analysis and losing contact with the fact that, for many people, the chicken and egg question matters precisely as a question about the real origin of the world and of life. For Model 1, the theologian sees a plus in the fact that it provides a detailed description of the mechanics of biological development, which can be viewed as an account of how creation is arranged at the level of nature. The minus is that, in a purely naturalistic reading, it leaves unanswered the questions of meaning, purpose, and the origin of the very laws by which eggs and chickens develop. For Model 2, the strength is obvious. It directly addresses the existential demand for origin and meaning, asserting that what came first was not impersonal nature, but a personal creator who made animals. The weakness is what the scientific community sees as insufficient empirical testability and, in some versions, a literal conflict with evolutionary biology data. For Model 3, the merit is that it helps the theologian formulate more clearly where the discussion concerns scientific descriptions of processes and where it concerns the metaphysics of cause and meaning, without mixing levels. The drawback is the possible blurring of doctrinal claims if criticism of language and causality is taken as a relativization of all answers, including theological ones. For Model 1, the physicist notes a plus. It fits into a well-confirmed scientific picture of the macro world, where causality is adequately described classically and does not require invoking quantum anomalies. The minus is the possible illusion that such classical causality is universal and fundamental, whereas at the quantum level, the pattern of causes and order may be different. For Model 2, the strength is its clear, linear, explanatory structure, which is psychologically and culturally close to many people, and easily integrates with religious experience. The weakness is the lack of connection with modern physical theories, including cosmology and quantum mechanics, if it is taken as a literal scientific account of the origin of species. For Model 3, the advantage is that it allows for the possibility that at a fundamental level, the familiar categories of earlier, later, and strict order may be only approximations, thereby making our language about causes more flexible. The drawback is the risk of overinterpreting quantum effects along the lines of everything is relative and one need not distinguish cause and effect, which contradicts both science and common sense at the macro level. The minimal consensus between the roles is this: biologically and historically, reproductive structures of the amniotic egg type, as well as eggs in the broad sense, appeared long before domestic chickens, so in this general sense, the egg came before the chicken. In moving to the narrow concept of a chicken egg, the answer depends on the definition. If it is taken to mean an egg from which a chicken hatches, then the first will be the egg with the first chicken. If by the one who laid it, then the chicken itself will be first. A key point of agreement is that the choice of answer depends not only on facts, but also on the framework, evolutionary, creationist, or philosophical quantum, each of which treats the notions of causality and beginning differently. The main disagreements concern whether a first-cause creator is needed to break the causal chain, whether infinite regress or more complex, non-linear causal structures are acceptable, and whether quantum concepts can be applied to the description of the macro world. The evolutionary biologist insists on the empirical priority of the egg and the gradualness of transitions. The theologian on the logical necessity of a creator and the primacy of living form. The philosopher on the analysis of definitions and strategies for stopping regress, and the physicist on the limits of the classical before-after intuition. Taken together, these approaches show that the answer to what came first, the chicken or the egg, functions as an indicator of basic worldview intuitions about cause, beginning, and order in the world, rather than merely as a piece of school biology knowledge. The most convincing arguments in terms of agreement with scientific data are those of the evolutionary biologist about the antiquity of amniotic eggs and the gradual formation of the line leading to the domestic chicken, since they rest on a wide range of paleontological, genetic, and zoological studies. The philosopher's analysis of causality stands out especially for logical consistency and for clarifying the structure of the question, showing the role of definitions and the difference between the local chicken-egg paradox and the broader issue of first cause and regress. At the same time, for understanding the worldview dimension of the dilemma, the presence of the theological position is important, as it articulates the demand for a first cause and meaning, and of the quantum physical position, which points to the limitations of intuitive ideas about linear causality. In the end, different answers to the question, what came first, the egg or the chicken, serve as indicators of different basic intuitions. Trust in evolutionary science as a sufficient explanation, faith in a creator as a necessary ground of order and meaning, orientation toward logical analytic concept analysis, or interest in non-classical quantum models of causality. The choice between models 1, 2, and 3 shows how a person thinks about cause, beginning, and order as a linear chain of natural processes, as the action of a personal first cause, or as a more complex, possibly non-linear and multi-layered structure of reality in which the very word first must be used with caution. Thank you for watching. Write in the comments what questions you would like to discuss. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next expert debates, and also check out my other social networks in the video description. Goodbye.